it's so much more impactful on the big screen. It must be so exciting for all of you as well. So let's
For sure.
let's start with the Martha Mitchell effect. We're talking about two pioneering women in very, very different ways, and the Martha Mitchell effect. And I lived through Watergate as a young reporter. I actually met Martha Mitchell once as a local reporter in Philadelphia. But the phenomenon that she was, it's hard to even describe it, but you have communicated that. Tell me how you got so interested in this, Anne.
Sure. Yeah, thank you. Well, when we first came across the story, we couldn't believe that we hadn't heard about her, that she had been completely lost to history. And we started digging some more and realized that she was this sort of phenomenal character, as you described. She was telegenic, she was hilarious, and she was really more of an instrumental figure in Watergate than she was ever given credit for. And that was kind of part of the reason she was lost to history in a way. I mean, she was sort of a victim of the Nixon administration's gaslighting campaign. I mean, him and his cohorts sort of, leveraged mental illness and addiction to discredit her, to silence her, essentially. And so we knew we wanted to make a film. We knew we had a good character on our hands to make a film.
And what about figuring out, was she a whistleblower? Who was Martha Mitchell? Debbie?
Yeah, that's how you define that is interesting. She was really pointing the finger at Nixon before any other prominent person did. She was calling out dirty tricks. She was saying that he should resign. So, you can consider that a whistleblower in many ways. And as Anne had said, she was discredited for doing that. So there was clearly some threat that she was posing to the administration. And in that sense, they wanted to silence someone who was a whistleblower of sorts.
What's so striking is the contrast between the Southern Belle, the woman with the bouffant hair, the wife, flirtatious and clever and very dramatic, vivacious, but the seriousness of her, of her concerns. I mean, how do you square that, her presentation, with what she actually was doing, the truth teller?
Yeah, I mean, I think she was a traditional Southern belle, as you described. She was incredibly flirtatious. Martha, as people have told us, really just wanted to hang out with the men. She didn't want to hang out with the women at all. She was an outlier, certainly, among the political wives of that generation. So I think, her modus operandi was to flirt and to sort of work that angle. That was the way she did it. But I also think that she really did have an honesty streak, and she really wanted to call out the truth and the dirty tricks when she did see it, to her detriment. I mean, she had a lot to lose as a Republican wife to cross party lines and sort of speak out. But I also think that she, it was sort of that, but also partly self-preservation, because she didn't want her husband to be thrown under the bus by Nixon. So it was sort of twofold in a way.
Was she not taken seriously at first because she's a woman?
Yeah, absolutely, because she was a woman, and because, as you said, she was this vivacious, bubbly Southern belle who liked to flirt with people. I'd say she flirted with men and women in different ways, actually. She was very charming in that sense. Yeah, and so I think she wasn't taken seriously for all of those reasons.
And the cruelty of the way her husband, turned on her. I mean, he gaslighted her. They all did, right?
Very much so. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think she had an inkling that something was up with her husband and that there was some culpability on his side. But I mean, to the end, she was defending him to try to save the marriage or to try to preserve, his integrity. And he just used her in the end.
Yeah, that quote that he gives towards the end, where it could have been much worse, he could have been sentenced to live with Martha Mitchell, was so brutal and so unnecessary for him to say. But they had such a loving relationship in the beginning, and it disintegrated so drastically and poorly, that he just felt the need to dig her publicly, which was really very brutal.
I mean, ultimately, we sort of, she has this amazing story, but ultimately we saw this as a love triangle, sort of Nixon and Martha sort of vying for the attention of John Mitchell. And in the end, he chose Nixon over his wife.
And I didn't know, even though I thought I had followed all of this so much, I didn't know about the multiple myeloma. I didn't know how quickly, she became ill and died. And was she all alone at the end?
Yeah, essentially she was alone. John Mitchell didn't want to see her. He kept their daughter away from her as well. Martha didn't want to see her friends. She was very much isolated. Winzola McClendon was her good friend at the time, and they were writing the book together, a biography of hers together. So she had Winzola, but she was very much alone at the end.
Ben, how did you fall in love with Sally Schmidt?
I found out about her story from a friend of mine, Kirsten Falk, who grew up in the Napa Valley. And I was actually telling her about Thomas Keller, and I was like taking his master class, and I was enamored of Thomas Keller. And she said, well, there's a whole story before Thomas Keller got to the French Laundry when Sally Schmidt owned it. And I said, who's Sally Schmidt? And she said, that's my godmother. And
really?
I said, oh, is she still around? She said, oh yeah, no, she's like the real, like, an unsung. And I remember Kirsten said, this is the kind of thing you make your short documentaries about. You should meet her. So I was totally intrigued. I love food. I love cooking. And as soon as I talked to Sally on the phone, who was so reticent, did not think there was a movie there, didn't think she had a story to tell. Are you sure you have the right person? She was kind of like that. And, it was pretty quick. I mean, you can kind of imagine this great story, this great backstory, the tale of two French laundries. There's all kinds of amazing footage from the era of Napa Valley coming of age. Nothing better than seeing really good food being made and presented on screen. So I thought it would make a good and meaningful film.
I was just fascinated by the history of Napa Valley, and just the ice on the trains, the refrigeration, and that footage is just remarkable.
Yeah, it's fun to imagine it as like a podunk place, that no one associated, like before that word Napa sparked all the images that it does, what got it there. And that's what I was so interested in, is that Sally kind of saw it as, where lettuce starts on the train ride to New York, to kind of like the fertile ground of haute cuisine in the United States.
Tell me about the process of interviewing her and shooting the movie.
Yeah, so it was a very unusual process because of COVID. So she had agreed to do the movie, and my dad got sick, and I had to go back to Nova Scotia, where I'm from. And we devised a way of filming with me in Nova Scotia, because I had to be there for my dad. And so we had the camera set up, and we had Zoom hooked up into the Interrotron, and we had this big plastic sheet. This was this is May 2020, so it was the era when we thought that when people left their packages on their front stoop for 3 days, because we were worried if we touched it. So we left the whole set for 3 days before Sally came on. And so Sally came and sat down, and I was in my parents' basement. My dad had just passed away 4 days before. And we had this conversation for, 6 or 7 hours. And I think that's why it went in the direction that it did about, the choices you make in life. My dad was a lawyer and, worked 16 hours a day and kind of hammered that into us as kids. And I think he died, he was 66 when he passed away. And I think he was pretty disappointed that he never got to do a lot of the things that he had put off. And so at that moment, talking to Sally, it kind of became imbued with those bigger questions about the decisions we make in life and what we value and what our priorities are. And I've never talked to anyone who has more wisdom and more integrity in actually following through decisions than Sally Schmidt.
That comes through so poignantly, because you can see and hear in her voice and in the way she's communicating that what you've drawn out of her is a tinge of the regret, looking at Thomas Keller, but
A tinge.
a tinge.
But that's
not
what I loved
bitterness.
about it.
Yeah.
No, no
Not at all.
bitterness. And really, how could you not kind of feel like, well, but I think she was pretty solid in her decision making, and I think that also makes her more relatable and human, that she could see both sides of it but still chose the one she chose.
And what a wonderful marriage.
Oh yeah. I mean, from start to finish, and like in the time sense, like I've had so many conversations with so many of her family members, and they're all like, yeah, it was like that. Like it was like that. Like Sally and Don, like they were, and there's a whole story with him. Like he was mayor of Yountville. He was an amazing guy too, and just a great supporter of her. Yeah, moving story.
And let me ask all of you, the process of finding the footage, that kind of research. I mean, you went to the Nixon Library.
Yeah.
I was recently interviewing Michael Beschloss at the National Archives, and someone from the audience asked, which of the presidential libraries do you like the best? And he very diplomatically said, well, they're like your children. I love them all. But as an historian, I mean, he just loves to spend time in presidential libraries. But I'm going to the Reagan Library next month to do something. They're just all fascinating. I remember as a young reporter, I went to the Truman Library just because I was in Kansas City covering the Republican convention. And, these archives are just brilliant. And the archivists are great. So you found a lot of cooperation.
Yeah, they're incredible repositories of history, and archivists are heroes. And yeah, we worked at the Nixon Library and did a couple of in-person research trips, and worked with an archivist there named Ryan Pettigrew, and who was really heroic throughout the pandemic, working with us and getting us materials that we needed. So we got a lot from them: the Super 8 materials, some news footage of Martha, lots of photographs, and then dug deep into university archives and other media archives that were unusual, that you might not think that Martha might exist in those places, and she did. So we uncovered a lot of footage of her at various places. And then a great interview came to us towards the end of our film. It was in a news journalist's attic on like 1-inch videotape, and he uncovered it for us, and we got it transferred, and that became like a really important interview in the film. Yeah, so it was fun. It was like a fun, complicated, and painful digging process. But yeah, the archive research was really, really quite a journey.
And I had not recalled that David Frost had interviewed her, as well as we all remember the Nixon interview and Nixon Frost, the movie, and all of the rest. But that's such a wonderful contrast, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Also, the interviews that you did.
The contemporary audio interviews? Yeah.
Well, all the interviews the people you found contemporaneously, how have their thoughts about her and her role evolved over the years, do you think?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, we interviewed Dwight Chapin, who was, a very strong cohort of Nixon's, and he still toes the party line. He doesn't think that she was an important character. He also sort of bought into the gaslighting. But then, we spoke to John Dean, who really, through, researching and writing his 14 books since Watergate, has really learned a lot more about Martha Mitchell, and through the tapes realized, she was way more instrumental than he actually originally thought at the time. So some of their opinions have changed and some of them haven't. So.
Yeah.
At what point did she get onto it? Was she always suspicious, do you think? When did she realize what Watergate was really all about? I mean, she must have realized it when James McCord popped up as one of the burglars because of his role in her family.
Yeah, I mean, definitely during the burglary. I mean, there's some speculation that if we want to get deep into like Watergate history, which I'm sure we don't want to do, but there was this seminal
I
like
think we did.
okay, let me tell
Exactly,
you.
don't we?
No. There was like, so supposedly there was a seminal gemstone meeting in March of 72, which is when supposedly John Mitchell did approve of the burglary, and Martha was there and other people were there, and they said that Martha was distracting John, and that is actually why Nixon says that Martha's responsible for Watergate, was that she was intruding and distracting her husband from doing his work. So she's to blame for
Because
the
his
scandal.
work was to approve, as the Attorney General, the top law
Or to not
enforcement
approve, right.
officer of the United States, to approve a break-in.
Yeah, they were gaslighting her even back then, saying that, she had drinking problems and she was erratic and she distracted John from doing his job properly, and that's why he couldn't do his job properly. And it's so ridiculous. Yeah.
Did you see the recent film? Was it a film, a television film?
Yeah, with
Gaslit?
Julia Roberts.
Yeah.
Yeah,
yes.
and Sean Penn. Yeah.
Oh, yes.
What was your reaction to that?
I'd say some episodes were better than others. And I couldn't see Julia Roberts as Martha Mitchell because she's just so much Julia Roberts to me. So, but I
Yes.
thought she was quite good in the role, and so was Sean Penn.
But the whole story of Martha Mitchell really lost to history until you brought it out, because you found the real Martha Mitchell, and by the way, no relationship. No,
I was going to ask.
no, not at all. But I'm just so surprised at myself at not having thought about her for all these years, when she really was such a seminal figure. And when we talk about pioneering women, I cannot think of two women more different than Sally Schmidt and Martha Mitchell. Ben, how would you, just on your take of seeing their film and knowing Sally Schmidt, how would you compare these?
Different as different? Well, they're both very honest people. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, they're both very honest people. I don't know. I don't think Sally she was all about the work in front of her. She wasn't a particularly like political person, I would say. Martha had that talent. Sally was really focused on running that amazing restaurant. But obviously she probably would have known about all of this. I mean, they were contemporaries, but I never got the chance to ask her. If I had known that I would be here tonight, I would have asked that question. And tell me, what do you think of Martha Mitchell? But yeah, I don't know.
Sally seems much more down to earth. Martha chased the spotlight. I mean,
Yeah.
and she liked it.
That's a key difference. Yeah, that's a key difference. Yeah.
I, of course, worked for decades with Helen Thomas, who, now, those weren't your interviews with Helen, because that was a much, much younger Helen. So she was...
Yeah, those are archival.
That's archival footage. Helen was just extraordinary. And as a young White House reporter covering Ronald Reagan, I used to just try to keep up with her. And we'd land someplace, in Germany, and we'd be told in the 80s the Greens were protesting, and she would just jump off the plane and start running. And, we were all carrying our, all of our bags and just running to the first event that we had to cover after an overnight flight. And she was just leading the pack. Wow. Aggressive and... forceful. So I can understand completely why Martha Mitchell. And those days, Helen was covering, she was she and the other women, McClendon and all of them, had to cover the East Wing. They started out that way. Then had
First
to break
lady.
through. First lady, yeah. As women were not really permitted to do what the men were doing. For me, this is also interesting because I started with a very small group of women in Washington who were reporters. Most importantly, Judy Woodruff, my friend, who was profiled wonderfully in the New York Times this Sunday, and Leslie Stahl. And it was really, really hard in those days. Cokie Roberts, some great women. So we all banded together, and that's the thing that people never really understood about us. But these two women were just even in an earlier time. I mean, contemporaneously with, because I was a reporter in the 60s and 70s, but they were in worlds that were completely barred from a woman speaking out the way Martha Mitchell did, a cabinet wife, my God, my Lord, and Sally Schmidt, what she and Don created is really amazing.
Yeah.
I don't think there's anyone really like her, because when you think about other great women chefs, they were in different worlds. They were not farm to table. You know, certainly Julia Child and French cuisine, and that is a category. But I think Sally Schmidt was really an original.
Yeah, she was. I mean, Alice Waters is owed a huge credit to the California cuisine movement as well, and they were pretty much contemporary and sort of, you know, a 3-hour drive from each other. But you know, I think the thing that is very unique about Sally, which is not totally dissimilar from Martha, is that like we've never stopped to really appreciate these stories. You know, for whatever reason, they're not commercial, or you know, somebody says, I can't see that being a movie or whatever, or there's some nefarious reason why the story, you know, it shouldn't get out or whatever. But I think that's what's beautiful, is like the truth gets out eventually. At Doc NYC, the truth gets out. So yeah, I'm happy for that.
Do we have time for some audience questions? I don't know if we have ways to do that, but it would be great to have some of you chime in.
Any questions?
It's hard to see with the lights, but yes, sir.
Ben, was your interviews, was it all one day? And how was the relationship if you were doing it?
Yeah, so we did like a pickup, like a couple hours the next morning, if I remember correctly. But it was a long conversation. I mean, she was 88 at the time, so I was like, you know, we'll go as long as we go, and when she gets tired, she went for like the whole day, the entire. I mean, we started at, what's your first memory in Roseville, and I think we got all the way through like the 80s. So, you know, I was worried about it. It was the first time I was doing one of these kinds of interviews remotely. But it's the same technology. It's just that I was over Zoom instead of in the next room. It's a teleprompter with my face on it to get the direct eye line. So it worked pretty well. And, you know, when you talk to somebody for that long, you share a lot about yourself, too. And so we actually, you know, were able to build a relationship in that we were both sharing, you know, our story with each other, which is kind of remarkable considering that I never shook Sally's hand, you know. I never met her. This was my one digital, I mean, such a strange COVID thing, interaction with her. But I did get to go back to her farm, and after she passed away in March, we filmed all the food stuff that you see, and it was like an incredibly emotional and cathartic experience because all of her kids that are in the movie that worked at the French Laundry all came to the family farm and pulled out the old handkerchiefs and the old forks and knives and, you know, recipe book, and they remade all these recipes that hadn't been made, you know, in, gosh, 35 years or whatever, and recreated their mother's cuisine, this sort of memorable meal that she recounted, and it was the most delicious food, bar none, that I've ever had, and we were all crying into the soup the whole time, and so that was special. Yeah, but it's kind of a funny, you know, digital, ethereal relationship between Sally and I.
That's really extraordinary, and she talks so much. I mean, that's the way you open your film, about balance. You've got the scales, balance in life, the choice she made with family, food, and being able to do these things and not become caught up in the celebrity.
Yeah.
But you never met her. I mean, clearly you alluded to this, that it was your what you were going through with your father that opened you to that aspect of her life?
I think so. I mean, you can't help but be a human being in making these films, right? Like, you find threads of your own life and, correlatives of the people that are in your life and other people's lives and things that jump out to you or hunches that you have about maybe there's something there. And I think, yeah, for me going through what I was going through at the time, that's what came through as like one of many golden threads of wisdom that her life represented, and that I thought would make a meaningful film that, didn't have a whole lot of conflict. It doesn't leap off the page as like, oh, that's got to be a movie, but I think is probably one of the most like meaningful movies to me personally that I've been a part of, for that reason. And I feel like it's a message that I need to continue to hear in my life. So I'm grateful to her, for teaching me that.
Do you think she had regrets at all about selling the restaurant?
I don't think so, honestly. And she probably is happy that she's not here for all this attention with the film. Knowing Sally, I asked her that question, and she answered it in the film. If she wanted to do it, she could have done it. She didn't want to do it. And I took her at her word. I don't think she regretted it. I think everybody likes credit where it's due, and I think Sally got less of it than she deserved, which is why we made the film. But I don't think it hurt her. I think she was an extremely happy person to the core.
That, of course, is a great contrast with Martha Mitchell. I mean, there's really a tragic sadness about the way her life ends, especially being separated from her child. Did you realize that going into it?
I mean, we knew how her story ended, yeah, and it is a really tragic, sad tale. She did have a short period of vindication where people did recognize her, and she did have plans to, she did guest appearances on talk shows, and she had plans to maybe do a talk show of her own. So the fact that she did get sick so quickly and had a sad story, yeah.
And in the end, with Martha Mitchell, what do you think her role really was? Do you think she was as important in uncovering all of the criminality around her?
I mean, it's hard to know what she knew, what she didn't know. I know when we first started this, we're like, we need to figure out exactly what she knew. But then in the end, we realized that wasn't as important as sort of the larger impact that she had. I think it's really a larger tale of, the personal cost to these scandals, like the collateral damage to this crazy thing that happened. And she was sort of thrown under the bus a little bit, as was her husband. So a little bit. So it's hard to say. And sort of, yeah, what are the personal costs? What happens? And also, sort of the power of soft power. Like, what would have happened had we all listened to her clarion call earlier? What are the costs and benefits to speaking out, speaking truth to power? I think that's sort of what we were trying to explore.
What's also striking is to be thrown back into that world where Richard Nixon, was described as, it's not that he didn't like women, he just didn't like loud women.
Yes.
Aggressive reporters women reporters were always called pushy or bitchy or something like that.
Whereas, and that still continues today.
Yes, it does. Whereas a man can, scream and shout and ask tough questions, but it's not considered, appropriate for women. And just the way they talked about her on the tapes. The tapes are really a revelation. You must have been wallowing in the Nixon tapes. That's quite an experience.
Yes, it is. Yeah, I mean, they spoke about her all the time. There was a lot that we left out.
So how do you get through it all? I mean, I guess it's now digitized, so you can do searches for references to her, but...
They're all online. I mean,
Yeah.
primarily all of them are online, through the Nixon Library or through another website. I think it's nixontapes.org. So yeah, they're accessible digitally. it's tricky to find the material that you're actually looking for on the tapes because of the way that they're logged and cataloged.
They're not all transcribed.
Yeah, and
Or
they're
if they
not
are
all
transcribed, they're
transcribed.
not transcribed correctly.
Yeah.
Like we found a lot of mistakes. So it was a tough go.
There's a lot of profanity, a lot of racism, obviously sexism,
Yeah.
yes, anti-Semitism. I mean, we've read about all the, the sort of really truly awful things.
Yeah, it's all there. And it's crazy because Nixon, he recorded himself primarily because he thought, well, he'll write his memoirs after his presidency. That was a big reason as to why he recorded everything. So he was such a narcissist, and that comes through on the tapes. I mean, some of the stuff that they talked about with Martha was so misogynist, talking about her appearance, about her weight, about like what she wore, her hairstyles. So it was the fact that they focused on those little details of her were just telling is how the character of these men.
I mean, he was also an unreliable narrator as well because he knew he was being recorded, so he would lie, because he was trying to protect himself. So it was a lot of negotiation, I think, to try to decipher what exactly was going on.
Have you decided what your next project is, or are you still living in this? Well, clearly.
We're enjoying the Martha world.
Enjoying the Martha world. Well, we want to thank you both, Ben and Anne and Deb, just for bringing this all to us. And really, the way you all have created films that create a whole new reality, a new life for characters whom we thought we knew. Well, we're not so much in Ben's case, but just a person that we would never have known. And so, with such great wisdom, a great life, well lived, and
Yeah.
thank you all so much.
Thank you.
you.
Yeah.
Thanks for coming.
Thanks for coming, everyone.